Thank you. That's incredibly generous. I feel like I should just walk off the stage and call it a morning, but it's so wonderful to be here with all of you. I've been looking forward to this. And as you heard, life got a little bit more complicated about a month ago, and I was even afraid I wouldn't be able to make it at all. I did get squeezed out of the joyful experience of being with you yesterday, but darn it, I'm here today, and I'm really soaking it up already. Worshiping with you, meeting dear friends that I haven't seen for a couple of years face to face, and now here we are, and what a blessing that is. Deb, I just want to say a big shout out to you for your remarkable leadership of BioLogos over these challenging times and over the times that we have ahead of us, whatever they are. So yeah, maybe a little bit of applause for Deb Harsma. We're blessed also to have Daryl Falk here, who is the first president of BioLogos, and many thanks to Daryl for his wise, thoughtful, winsome leadership through all this time. And David Bowler, thank you for all of your efforts to make this conference so smoothly successful, and a big shout out to all the BioLogos staff that have worked really hard to put this together. I'm here as a private citizen, not as a representative of the U.S. government, which means I get to say what I really think, well, up to a point. There might be a little bit of a limitation there in the sense of somebody might tweet about it, but I will try not to create any kind of controversy today. But I am interested to talk with you about this particular area that BioLogos is right in the middle of. How do we bring science and faith together at a troubled time? Because we will all have to admit we are at a troubled time. How do we find truth and love in the midst of a pandemic? Well, the title here, With All Your Mind, is a fond reflection for many of us of the words of Jesus. When asked, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" This is in Matthew. Jesus replies, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." If you go back to Deuteronomy, where this seems to be a quote, it's a slight difference. In Deuteronomy, it was with all your strength at the end. Jesus says, with all your mind. Boy, does that kind of resonate with a BioLogos perspective. Aren't we here to love the Lord through our worship, through our hearts, through our souls, but also through our minds, being able to celebrate the creation that God has given us, and to use science as the means of discovering that awesome elegance and beauty that's all around us, and to understand its intricacy, its remarkable laws, and how they, without our having to really understand them, create this remarkable world, this universe that we can live in, that you heard about a lot yesterday. So for me, that very much fits with this sense that as a scientist who's also a follower of Jesus, these things fit together, and I'm always fond of just the visual representation of that, something I ran across many years ago, showing here the comparison, which is pretty eye-catching, of the rose window in York Minster. It looks like a lot like the rose window in the National Cathedral in D.C., which I occasionally get to go and see. But then also next to that, the view of DNA that you're not used to. Usually you're looking at it from the side. Think about looking down the long axis, and then you see this beautiful radial pattern. There's beauty and awe there as well. People who are, I think, not fully aware of what it's like to be a scientist and a believer seem to have the sense that maybe science just reduces everything to, facts and figures, and the awe goes away. Boy, is that not true. The awe only gets greater as you understand and see the beauty, and especially when you see in it the hand of the Creator. So I've had this privilege, as Deb told you, of walking through in my scientific career a whole host of experiences that have certainly added to my awe and my gratitude for having the chance to be given the opportunity to do this kind of discovery of God's world, even while reading God's Word and trying to understand how it all fits together. Yes, I did have the great privilege now, more than 30 years ago, working with colleagues, to find the cause of cystic fibrosis, and now to see today the development of a triple therapy, which for 90% of patients with cystic fibrosis means that a life that was very uncertain and often associated with early death after multiple hospitalizations now is associated with planning for retirement, which is just an amazing thing to be able to say. I did have the privilege of leading the Human Genome Project over a remarkable period of years, inventing technologies to read out that script for human biology, all 3 billion letters. And it took an amazing team to be able to do that, some 2,400 scientists in 6 countries laboring together over 13 years to come up with this first view of our own instruction book. And I have to say, it has just been a remarkable experience for me now every day. As I look at the complexity of the human body, things that we are able now to begin to unravel, because we can look at single cells and ask them what they're doing, which genes are on or off. We're looking at parts of the body that are incredibly complicated, like the brain. And somehow that is all encoded back at the point that you were one cell in this finite instruction book of 3 billion letters. That is just beyond belief in terms of the elegance, the awe that inspires. I never get over that. And yeah, we are now at the 20th anniversary of the Genome Project, and I would say we're just scratching the surface of understanding how to use this to understand ourselves. It's a textbook of medicine, as well as a history book, as well as, I guess, a parts list, but it's also an opportunity for worship. Then as NIH director, I did have the chance, working with many others, to initiate other large, challenging projects that might have taken a long time to get started without a push. So I was the pusher who, maybe that's not the best use of the word, I was the guy who tried to inspire action in areas like the brain. And we did initiate a program which is now about 7 years along to try to understand how those 86 billion neurons between your ears do what they do, which is probably the most complicated structure in the known universe. And it's going to take us a while to figure that out. But we now have a census of the cells in the brain that we didn't know about before, because you can ask each cell, what's it doing? And we thought we understood, well, you know, maybe there are 8 or 10 cell types and that's it. There are hundreds of different cell types. Again, the complexity, the awe that this is somehow all encoded in biological terms within that original first cell, just mind-bending to contemplate. I've also been very focused on what we could do, not just to try to treat disease when it happens, but how do we prevent it? And how do we take advantage of this awesome complexity of humanity where we are all descended from one common set of ancestors, so we're all one big family, but we're different. And we have different genomes, and we have different environments and different health behaviors. And if you really want to practice medicine in a way that helps everybody, you want to capture those differences. And that's what we call precision medicine or precision health. And this program called All of Us, which is on its way towards enrolling 1 million people, is the way in which we're going to really figure this out. I'm curious, is there anybody here who's signed up for All of Us? You don't have to tell me, but yes, I see some hands. If you haven't, join allofus.org. It's not too late. We're up to about 440,000 on the way to 1 million. If you join up, you get your genome completely sequenced, and we'll tell you what we found. You will be able to find out a lot of other things about you from various other lab tests. You will help us by sharing answers to questionnaires. You'll walk around with wearable sensors. You will make your anonymized electronic health record available so that researchers can begin to figure out what's in there. This is going to revolutionize our understanding of how to keep people healthy, not just how to treat disease. Join allofus.org. Well, therapeutically, I have to say, one of the greatest excitements that I see now, because as a guy who studied genetics, it seemed all too often that we were pretty good at diagnosis, but we weren't very good at treatment. Cystic fibrosis was a great example where we got there, but for a lot of others we didn't. Sickle cell disease, the first molecular disease, discovered more than 100 years ago, and yet still we haven't had much to offer to those patients who go through amazing, awful suffering from sickle cell crises. But all that is changing. Now with the tools of gene therapy and gene editing, it has been possible in a dozen or so cases to take young adults with sickle cell disease. And not just make them feel a little better, they are cured. We are able to go to the bone marrow and do something to fix that single letter that's wrong, and they basically end up with a whole new life ahead of them. And boy, if that's not inspiring. And there are thousands of other genetic diseases that are sort of waiting their turn to come next because they have the same circumstance where we know the misspelling, we just have to figure out what to do. And with things like CRISPR, we're on a path to being able to offer a lot of hope to all of those. So that was the experience I was having as NIH director. Everything seemed to be in a very good place. We were making progress on many different fronts, more than I have time to tell you. And then it was early January of 2020. And these articles were coming out. And just a couple days after the Washington Post article you see there up on the internet was published, the sequence of the RNA genome of SARS-CoV-2 as analyzed by a group in China. And it was clear this is a coronavirus, and it was clear that this was a serious, serious situation, that there was probably more bad things happening in Wuhan that were being admitted, given how much the city was being shut down. And we had to be prepared for this to go really badly. Now, many of us knew we were overdue for this kind of a pandemic. And we'd had SARS 20 years earlier and MERS 6 or 7 years earlier. So the idea that it might be a coronavirus was not all that surprising, although I think most people guessed it would be an influenza virus. But here it was. NIH, as the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world, thanks to your tax dollars, was in the position to be able to jump forward and see what could be done, and to do so at record speed. And so working in these three areas of our three-legged stool here, diagnostic, therapeutics, and vaccines, the response of the scientific community and institutions all over the country, all funded by NIH, and with much of the work being done on our own campus in Bethesda, responded in a way that was just breathtaking. People dropped everything they were doing. People were willing to get into partnerships and not worry about who was going to get the credit. People worked 24/7. The Congress came up with funds to do things that were risky because you had to take risks if this was going to have a chance of success. And of course, the big push for many of us was a vaccine. We wanted therapeutics, and we worked hard on those, and we got things like remdesivir, and we wanted diagnostics, and you can get some of those at the drugstore now because that's how they got developed to do quick home testing. But we really needed a protection, a vaccine. Fortunately, a lot of work had been done, and I'm not sure everyone fully appreciated that over the years, about a new approach using messenger RNA that might make it possible to develop vaccines faster and more effectively. But it had been kind of back there a little out of sight. 12 years of this, trying to figure out how this might work, and particularly how it might work for a coronavirus, because it was being studied for MERS, that other coronavirus. So when the time came, Barney Graham, Kizzmekia Corbett, Tony Fauci, John Mascola, and their colleagues in the Vaccine Research Center at NIH pulled out all the stops. Now, it was necessary, of course, not to put all your eggs in one basket, so there were no less than 6 vaccines that were prioritized and substantial funds provided through Operation Warp Speed to make it possible for these to be developed and rigorously tested as quickly as humanly possible. The 2 at the top, the messenger RNA vaccines, happen to be the ones that got there first because this is a technology that can go quite quickly. All you really have to know is the letters of the genetic code of that virus to be able to start making an mRNA vaccine. Punch it in, synthesize that same series of bases in this messenger RNA that codes for that spike protein. All of these vaccines worked to try to generate immunity against the spike protein on the surface of SARS-CoV-2 so that your system is primed. And then if you see it later in a real virus, you're ready to jump on it. That's the principle. The mRNA vaccines by Moderna on the one hand and Pfizer Biotech on the other were tested initially to be sure that they didn't cause any surprise reactions. They didn't. They were tested in a small study to see if they would actually generate antibodies that looked like they would work. But then, the big moment, you've got to run a really big trial to find out. Is it safe? Is it effective in the real world? Both of these enrolled at least 30,000 patients And we should all be grateful to those people, that's 60,000 altogether, who signed up to take part in these trials. They didn't know if they were getting the vaccine or a dummy shot of salt water. And neither did the people giving the shot. That's how you do this, so you really know whether it's going to work or not. It's too easy otherwise to fool yourself. And we all waited. And the enrollment happened starting in July of 2020. And then you had to get 30,000 people, and then you had to watch them for a while to see, were there cases of COVID popping up? And if so, were they in the people who got the vaccine or the people who got the dummy shot? And then you can start to do the calculation. What is the percent efficacy? I did a lot of praying in the summer and fall of 2020 because most vaccines don't work. Anybody who'd done this before would say, you know, it's nice you got 6 here, maybe one of them will work, but probably not. And even if it works, well, a pretty good vaccine might have 50% efficacy. Maybe flu right now is having a good year if it's 50% effective against the strains that are circulating. So on that Sunday night, when I got the call that the data was ready to be unblinded, and they wanted Tony and myself and a few others to be able to hear the results in real time, my heart was in my mouth, and prayers were on my lips. And when the answer came, 95% for Pfizer, 94% for Moderna, I confess I cried like a baby. And I gave thanks for an answer to prayer. Yeah, this was science, but this was answer to prayer. This is how God answers our prayers when we're looking for protection sometimes. It's working through God's children, all of us, to try to come up with those answers and using the tools that we've been granted as scientists to be able to understand nature to actually do something that's going to save lives. And then I thought, okay, we're going to be all right. I got my shot. I got my second shot. I bet a lot of you all did too. And things began to rev up. People started, go back there on that graph, you can see January 21, number of shots per day going up, got up to about 4 million a day, and okay, but it didn't stay up there, did it? This is where I completely failed to appreciate the resistance that might be there. I'm a scientist. I figured the data is so compelling. I can show you those studies, 95% efficacy, and in those big studies of 30,000 people, no safety signals at all to worry about. Now, when we got to the point where millions of people were getting vaccines, there were rare events, the myocarditis that you heard about, the blood clotting problem you heard about from Johnson & Johnson. Those all in the sort of range of 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 100,000. Compared that to the likelihood of dying of COVID, it was still, in FDA's view, an incredibly compelling case in favor of. But stuff started to happen. What was already some skepticism about vaccines built perhaps on the efforts that groups had been putting forward that maybe childhood vaccines weren't safe, even though the data to support that connection with autism is utterly non-existent. That still was out there. And of course, people were in a tough spot. We're in a pandemic, everybody's under stress. The social media is going crazy with conspiracy ideas about what's really happening. And so that climb up to 4 million then began to be a decline, down, down, down. And you can see what's happened since then. Now, as of today, 76% of Americans have gotten at least one shot. What I'm sort of surprised about is that only about half of those who got the initial 2 shots have now gotten the booster, even though the booster is clearly beneficial in the face of Delta and Omicron that came along somewhat later. But yet people have not quite gotten to that point of recognizing that for various reasons. And yeah, I know, I didn't feel very good after the first shot. I didn't feel that great after the second one, but it was a 24-hour thing. And boy, I was glad to know it must have worked. But now the tragedies that I struggle with every day and wonder, how did we fail? How did I fail in terms of conveying the information about this so that people turned away from what could have saved them? This is a heartache. This is Josh and Christine Tidmore. They're in Alabama. Josh and Christine, with 3 kids, were a little skeptical about the vaccines. Weren't totally opposed. They're an evangelical church that was founded by Josh's grandfather. Many of the people in the church weren't sure about this, weren't sure they could trust the scientists. An article got circulated saying that Tony Fauci, who's obviously been a very prominent spokesperson, was actually on the take and was getting some sort of kickback for promoting vaccines. Let me assure you that's not the case. And that made them more skeptical. And so by July of 2020, even though there had been many chances for vaccination, they decided not to. And then they both got sick. And they tested positive, and they quarantined. And Christine got better over the course of a few days, but Josh didn't. His cough got worse and worse. On August 11th, in the ICU, on a ventilator, all the efforts basically failed. And Josh, a few days short of his 37th birthday, died, leaving 3 kids and a wife. His wife actually went very public about this, recognizing that the vaccine probably would have saved him. Went on the local television station, went to her church. She wasn't well received. There were people in the church who were really quite angry with her and even said, "Why are you talking about this? There is no such thing as COVID. This is just the flu or something," and they're all making this up. And certainly there were many people who tried to tell her that the vaccine wouldn't have helped, and maybe it even would have made things worse. So the resistance, and particularly in this instance, from their own community of people who follow Jesus, was palpable. You all know about this. We've all experienced it. It is heartbreaking. We of all people of truth and love, it would seem, would be in the space here to say, no, wait a minute. Let's figure out how do we love our neighbors given this kind of opportunity. And yet, somehow, white evangelicals especially have been the most susceptible to the information, the misinformation, sometimes the disinformation that has led to an opposite view. This is data from Pew, who does these surveys regularly. This is a few months old, but it hasn't changed much. You can see here the way in which they've broken down those who are not vaccinated versus vaccinated by their faith, and you'll see those green bars under Protestant are smallest. Are largest for white evangelicals. The blue bars smallest. Interestingly, the people that seem to be most embracing vaccines are the atheists. I don't quite know how to take that. So how did this happen? How did this happen to God's people? One thing I've learned is that lecturing, which I started to do, is not a useful approach. Got to do some listening, Francis. Come on here. In listening, I've learned that everybody who's in this situation is struggling to figure out what is true. And those who decide not to embrace the vaccine often have different reasons than the person sitting next to them. So I do think, and here's where BioLogos has an even more important mission than ever, that there is this long-standing undercurrent of distrust of science and scientists that plays in. Building back from the controversies about the age of the earth and about evolution. And therefore, I think people of faith are likely to assume that scientists are all atheists. And we all know in BioLogos that ain't true at all. And scientists sometimes come across as a bit elitist. Yeah, we do. And sometimes in the course of COVID, the messages have not been crisp and clear. And they've changed. And we as scientists would say, well, of course they had to because we had new data. You're supposed to change the message when you have new data. But I don't think we did a great job at the beginning of explaining that that was going to happen. And so it seemed as if people were jumping around with their recommendations and people listening felt manipulated. It's absolutely clear in our current circumstance that politics and faith have gotten tangled up in all sorts of ways that I don't think are healthy for faith, and were in the case of public health, particularly damaging, even to the point of causing lost lives. And in many churches, it seemed the political messages were those that were getting the strongest embrace. And the messages from Jesus were a little bit off to the side, like, yeah, we sort of believe that too, but. And to see that happening to God's people, wow. I think that did reflect that we have a vulnerability in terms of how in our churches, and maybe particularly evangelical churches, we have not done our appropriate work in spiritual formation and in catechism, basically, getting the foundation firmly anchored. Somebody told me yesterday that most church services now seem like a combination of a Coldplay concert and a TED Talk. You know what I mean? And how much spiritual formation are you getting there? And of course, cable news is winning the battle for people's eyeballs and attention hours every week, whereas maybe you got that 1 hour on Sunday morning. The pastors are working against a terrible uphill battle here with all of the other messages coming from other sources. And then social media, which we all recognize, is particularly good at spreading anger and lies. That's how the algorithms work. Love, truth, those don't seem to be that interesting to get sent on to other people. So we're in a mess here. All of that leading then to what is generally recognized as a unique time, at least for the past many decades, where we are shifted into tribal spaces, and that we are divisive about things that we shouldn't be, and we are comfortable, especially if in an anonymous setting like social media, exercising vitriol against people we may not even know. I know this. I probably get 4 or 5 truly hateful emails every day. I hope some of them are written by bots, because they're sufficiently ridiculous that it's hard to take them seriously, but some of them are clearly quite serious. And many of them from Christians, and many of them basically saying, you are an imposter. You can't really be a follower of Jesus if you said this or that in some interview that you did that basically defended science. This is deeply troubling. On the other hand, there's also a chance, I got to say this because in our worship this morning, I was trying to think, okay, what's the thing I'm going to focus on from yesterday? And I had a tough day yesterday as the co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, and we were wrestling with a lot of things like, what do we do about wildfires? What science could we bring to that? So my head was spinning with that. But an amazing thing happened, and I do think this is what I concluded was God's message. On the plane, as we were landing in San Diego, plane's still dark, I can't quite see who's coming down the aisle. Flight attendant comes by and just hands me a card and then walks away. And I look at the card, and she said, I recognize you. You have really helped me and my family in this time of COVID. And also, you've talked about your faith, and that made me feel like I could trust you. Okay. Yeah, that was a gift. But all of this is not just an unfortunate disagreement, although a culture war is bad enough. In this case, the culture war is costing lives. The pandemic by last summer became a pandemic of the unvaccinated. The deaths that we have had, hundreds of thousands of them since last summer, have almost entirely been amongst people who are unvaccinated who did not need to die. And that is so hard to be able to absorb without thinking, what could we have done differently? BioLogos worked hard on this. Kudos to Deb and the team. Anybody who was looking at the website was getting the information they might need. 5 reasons Christians should get the vaccine, starting back as soon as it became available. I want to say a word about Curtis Chang, who's just done a wonderful bit of work to try to get that information in front of pastors and regular folks in the work that he's done with Christians and the vaccine. And I did a podcast with him, a little clip of which I think Deb mentioned yesterday was actually used in a scientific study to say that seeing somebody saying that they're a follower of Jesus actually changed the view of a few people about whether to accept the vaccine or not. And then BioLogos getting this opportunity for people to sign up, and thousands of you did, to say, yes, you look at the science and you agree this is something that we should do, not just for ourselves, but for our immunocompromised and unvaccinated neighbors who might otherwise be the ones that we infect. And I imagine, I don't know, it's probably hard to know how much good that did, how many people basically got vaccinated who wouldn't have. But still, as of January, here we are in an article in Stat saying, stubborn high resistance amongst white evangelicals. We have not really gotten through here. So what's going on? This is what I have just absolutely struggled with for the last 9 months. I didn't see this coming. I figured, yes, there would be a few people who were just totally resistant and had ideas that weren't going to be changed. But to have 50 million Americans who are still unvaccinated, even now, I did not imagine that. And I have to think, I just don't understand. And I must, in my own way, by not understanding, have failed to be a good communicator about these information. That forced me to go back and try to really take apart how it is that we make decisions. And I confess, as a scientist who's sort of always focused on the rational, I didn't think that was complicated. I thought we were rational actors. I was kind of like a fan of this guy, René Descartes. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It's all about thinking brings you to rational conclusions, right? I've kind of lived my life as if that was true, but probably I wasn't really living my life because now I'm a bit more introspective about this and realizing there's a lot more to this. And that brought me to a different view. David Hume. People can't quite decide if he was an agnostic or an atheist, but he certainly wasn't a Christian. But he was pretty insightful about human nature. In his book, A Treatise on Human Nature, points out in a rather famous phrase that reason is a slave to the passions. If you think that your reason is going to bring you to a conclusion that you can defend without influenced by any of your other baggage, think again. Well, that's kind of discouraging, isn't it? There's a better way to say this by a Christian who I greatly admire in the Pensées, Blaise Pascal. But he's kind of saying what Hume did. The heart has its reasons, which reason knows nothing of. Okay, I like it that that's the heart. That implies that the heart has reasons that maybe are good and noble. They're about truth and goodness and beauty, but maybe they're not always. So this says, I've got to rethink how we got to this place with some neuroscience involved, because there's neuroscience underneath all of that. And how can I then figure out a way to begin to find common ground with those people who are in a very different place, but who also think they have the truth, and they're followers of Jesus too. And I realize I got a lot of work to do. So I want to tell you about the work I'm doing now, which is very much a work in progress. I'm not quite sure where it's going to go. It's interesting and it's challenging, and it involves a group called Braver Angels. They were founded about 6 years ago by a guy named David Blankendorf. And he has a staff of very hardworking, very dedicated people. And their goal is to bring together the divided parties in a safe environment with a moderator where they can begin to try to really listen to each other and perhaps understand each other's perspectives in ways that they haven't previously been doing. Actually, it's David Brooks, who will speak to us tonight, who told me about Braver Angels. So talking to them, they said, yeah, we're kind of interested also in how we might bring together public health people like you, Collins, and just regular citizens who don't trust public health, and try to figure out what went wrong there, and could we understand each other a little better? So they said, we'd like to set up a series of conversations, first with you and an example of the community that you need to listen to, and then we'll do some focus groups and some larger sessions. We haven't gotten to those yet. But I have met the person that is now sort of my alter ego, and this is Wilkinson. Wilk runs a trucking firm in Minnesota, and he runs a podcast which has an interesting name, which tells me, okay, we're going to be in a somewhat better place here. It's called Derate the Hate. Wilk is really troubled by the divisiveness and the willingness to throw hateful language around. At the same time, he is very sure that his perspective as a Trump voter, as a skeptic about most of what the government does, is the right perspective. But we just ought to try to be more civil about it. So that is Wilk. And Wilk and I have had probably now 4 hours of pretty intense conversation, trying to understand each other in a respectful way, some moderated, some not. And I think it's begun to sink in a bit about how we might come up with a framework, at least a framework that helps me to understand how we could communicate with each other and understand and find that common ground that I so desperately want to find. But this requires me to bring up another philosopher. You thought you were done. We got one more. And this one, I will have to take a moment to say thank you to the resident philosopher of BioLogos, Jim Stump, because he introduced me to this guy, Willard Van Orman Quine. I never took a philosophy course in college. I didn't know any of this stuff, and I'm probably misstating it terribly, and Jim will straighten me out later after this. But basically, he also is very interested in this concept of beliefs and how are people basically coming to the perspective they have about things they hold to be true based on childhood, based on culture, based on their own decisions, and how can you depict that? And I'm always a guy who likes to depict things visually, and Willard Van Orman Quine talks about the web of belief. A web. Okay, here's a web. Let's say this is my web of belief. By the way, the artwork from here on, done by my granddaughter. I just want to point that out. So yeah, spider web. So, think about the stability of a web also as kind of the stability of your system of beliefs. The stuff in the middle there is pretty important. If that starts coming apart, the web's probably going down. But some of the outer threads, you could take one away or add one there. It wouldn't be all that threatening. Think about that as the way in which you also have your own web of belief. Maybe imagine it right now. Things in the middle of that you care deeply about. If somebody tries to tell you that's not true, you're going to be strongly resistant. Your cognitive bias is going to kick in a big hurry, and you're going to blow them off, or you're going to say that's not a trustworthy source. Whereas if somebody has some new information from you further out on the edges of your web, you're going to be like, okay, let me listen to that. I might accept that. So this is my web. So what is in it? On the plane last night, I thought, okay, let's put some specificity into this. Okay, science is trustworthy. I'm putting that in the middle of my web. It's been my whole professional life. My wife loves me. That's in the center too. I hope she's listening and agrees with that. My cat loves me. She's a cat. What do you know? Jesus died for me. I'm putting that right in the middle. If somebody tries to tell me that's not true, I'm going to have a conversation maybe, but it's not going to get very far with their dissuading me from that one. And they will not dissuade me from the resurrection is true. If somebody tells me, well, we've now found the bones of Jesus, I'm going to say, okay, your data on that is going to have to be absolutely astounding because Jesus rose from the dead. So those are things in the middle. But some of my faith perspectives, I don't really understand why some people are premillennials and others are postmillennials and others are amillennials. I could sort of tell you what those things are, but I've never been able to really attach myself to one of them. So I'll put that on an outer edge. And if you want to tell me my current premillennialism might need to be revised, I'd be listening to you. Now go to science. Vaccines are safe and effective. Yeah, I didn't put it all the way to the middle because I know there are rare circumstances where people have been harmed by these. Fortunately, very rare. Public health needs experts. Yeah, I think so. This is the kind of thing where you want people who really know what to do with the data. The CDC is always right. Well, I wish I could put that in the middle, but I really can't. I think the CDC director would admit that. This has been a tough time for CDC. Mandating masks in schools was essential. It seemed like at the time, maybe. Right now, I'd put that one a little further out. And if you showed me data that was absolutely convincing that it did no good at all, I'd listen to you. But now other things, climate change. talked about that yesterday. Climate change is real. Yeah, the data for me, that's just overwhelming. And that humans are involved, that goes in the center. Politics. Joe Biden won the 2020 election. Yeah, he really did. And then more subtle issues, social issues, structural racism. As NIH director, I looked at all that data and concluded that not only is it real, it probably is real in the biomedical research community as well. And we have to take that seriously. So that's my web. Okay, how about Wilk? Now, I have not cleared this with Wilk, so Wilk, if you're watching, we can revise this later. I'm just going on some of the things that you've told me in these 4 hours of conversation. So what's number one thing that comes up in my conversation with Wilk? Government is overreaching. That is in the center of his view of what's going on right now in the country. His wife also loves him. And he has a dog, so he has greater confidence. He's a Christian, but he's maybe not quite as outspoken about that. That doesn't mean it's not just as central. So please, Wilk, if you're listening, don't take too much into where that arrow goes or that one either. We share those things. The world was made in 7 days. As a young earth creationist, he would say probably that's the most likely conclusion, but he's not sold on it. Vaccine safe and effective, he's not at all sure about that. He and his wife did get vaccinated. Interestingly, his argument was that was a better way to get the country to herd immunity. It's like, well, yeah, but that would be one of the effects. But he saw there was no real benefit to himself. Public health policy violates freedom. He has definitely felt that. It's another example of government overreaching. The CDC is not right. It's mostly wrong. Mandating masks in school was never appropriate, never should have been done. Where did I go? Climate change is not real. He is not convinced of that, although you could probably get him a little closer to it with more data. And yes, he would say, as a large fraction of Republican white evangelicals would say, is that there was something wrong with the election. It was rigged. So, and furthermore, on the social grounds, he is one, as many are, who have targeted this phrase of critical race theory as being harmful to our society. So is it hopeless for Wilk and me to find common ground? Well, our webs of belief are certainly very different. But think about a spider web. It doesn't just float free in the air. It's got to be anchored to something. Here's where I think there is some hope. We both agree there's too much hate. So how do we take our webs and figure out what they're anchored to and try to find those as common ground? And here's where another drawing from granddaughter Bailey kicks in. I try to picture this as pillars. And these are just my ideas of what those pillars might look like, although I think they have reasonable scriptural basis. And there's 7 of them. Love is in front, going around counterclockwise, family, faith, freedom. Going around clockwise from love, though, we have those 3 things that most philosophers agree are unique to humanity: truth, beauty, and goodness, that we are searching for those things. And it turns out Wilk believes in those 7 pillars too, as I do. Interesting, I ran across this a few days ago. Proverbs chapter 9, verse 1. Wisdom has built her house. She has set it up on 7 pillars. And there have been long discussions about what were the 7 pillars, because Proverbs doesn't tell you. Was that supposed to make you think of something, or is it just, a good house is going to have pillars, and 7's a good number? Anyway, I couldn't help but notice that. It probably doesn't mean a lot. So there we have our pillars, and there is my web. And I think it's attached to all of those. But what matters more is not what's in the web, but what's in the pillars. And then there's Wilk's web. And his is quite different than mine, but we're all still in the same place here as far as what's anchoring this. And those 4 hours of conversation, we started out with stuff in the web, and now we've gotten much more into what's in the pillars. And that gives me hope. that we haven't gotten so far apart that we can't find ourselves back to this kind of common denominator. So finally, how do we find hope in these dark times? I don't know if you read David Brooks' piece in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, very thoughtful about what's happening to evangelicalism and how do we try to put it back together again. He says he goes to a lot of meetings, maybe like this, where people talk about the troubles and the divisiveness and the tribalism, and then the diagnosis is clear, and you get to the last session, and they're supposed to be, okay, now we're going to fix it. And his description of those sessions goes like this: mumble, mumble, mumble. Well, it was great seeing y'all. That's it. I don't want us to do that at this meeting. So I'll take a little bit of a stab at it, but I hope we can have more chances, maybe in the questions and maybe in the rest of today's discussion about what we can do. Because I think BioLogos is in a very important place to help find hope in these dark times. By the way, Winston Churchill kind of got it right. Yeah, we're going through hell. But as he says, if you're going through hell, keep going. Don't stop there. We must not settle for what we're in the midst of right now, as if it's just, that's all it's going to be. Keep going. We do still share those 7 pillars. I think, in fact, most people who aren't really of faith, except for that faith pillar, they're pretty good about the other 6. Many Christians do sense that something is deeply wrong. Surveys done, something like 70% of white evangelicals are open to the idea of some kind of reconciliation. They just don't quite know what to do to get that to happen. Russell Moore says that he's quite confident that there is a large number of people sitting in the pews on Sunday morning who are convinced that something's not right with all of the animosity and the hate and the way in which we have put people into tribes, but they aren't quite sure what to do about it. So maybe then a return to truth and love is possible, but how do we do that? It's not by claiming political messages. It's got to be by reclaiming Jesus, which is what the church is all about. But it's going to start with each one of us. We can have some big, large movements. Maybe that'll happen, but it won't happen unless we all decide that we're part of this. One thing I've wondered about, should we have a pledge? Pugwash, back in 1979, when there was a concern about nuclear war, getting a lot of students and adults to sign up about how they were going to do everything they could to prevent that kind of catastrophe. Tens of thousands of people signed up. Well, what if we had, at this point, a pledge, that we would all pledge that we would, in this discourse about the truth, we would agree never to share information that might be false. That's where a lot of the problem is. And certainly never to generate it ourselves, but not even to propagate it. And also to approach all of these discussions, not in a state of anger, but doing the BioLogos thing graciously, and engaging in civil dialogue, trying to understand each other. And could we do things that would be more systematic as opposed to accidental in terms of reaching out to people that we really don't agree with, as I'm now trying to do with Wilk, and see what we could learn one-on-one or in small groups, because we are so far apart and many of us don't really circulate with people who are not in our own sort of bubble. I think BioLogos may be in a significant place. We are the organization now that stands up for the truth of Scripture and the truth of science. We're serious about our Christian faith, and we're serious about the fact that science can teach us things that are reliable about how nature works and how lives can be saved. We have credibility here. Maybe we need to think about even greater reach for that, but not by ourselves. Coalitions of like-minded groups, I don't even quite know who they are. Braver Angels would be a place to start, but there's others in this space that are trying to look for reconciliation. And there is growing, I think, a sense in the evangelical church that something needs to be done over. There's a group, and Ann Snyder may speak about that this evening, that has been meeting informally, trying to figure out how do we put the kind of evangelicalism that is all about love and truth back together again. Maybe we don't have to worry too much about denominations. I never understood them, by the way, having not grown up in a Christian church. Maybe we just all ought to be Christians and figure out what is the anchor of our faith that we may have kind of lost connection to, and how do we bring it back? And of course, amongst all, above all, time for urgent prayer and reflection. We are at a critical time for the future of our planet and the future of our faith. So finally, I started out my search a few months ago talking about how to find the truth. And this verse, of course, from John chapter 8 is the one that we refer to and even non-Christians refer to about the truth will set you free. But look at the phrasing. The Jews had believed him, so he's speaking to believers. If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, which apparently comes from Jesus' teaching, and the truth will set you free. That tells me, and I hadn't thought about this enough, the truth is complicated. It is not just those facts from your latest scientific experiment. It's also the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, and all the rest of what we learn as we study and restudy and relearn the messages of Jesus Christ. So if we could take that version of truth and spread it around, it's hard to imagine that that wouldn't have the kind of impact that our world so desperately needs right now. And with that, I would say thank you to all of you, and I'd be glad to hear your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Francis. It is so helpful to hear your thinking on this, especially in light of this present moment. I love the web of belief and the new artwork. You have to thank your granddaughter for all of us.
She'll be tickled to hear that you liked it because she was a little nervous. She is a freshman at the University of Michigan, majoring in graphic design. So this was her, I think, her first paid project.
It's exciting. So those 7 pillars, like how did you come up with those? Or say a bit more about them. I think that's so fascinating.
Well, it started out at a shorter list, but I kept thinking, oh, wait a minute, you got to have freedom in there. You certainly have to have love. Again, those who have thought much deeper than I ever had about what's special about humanity, the truth, beauty, and goodness have to be in there. Pretty soon you're at 7. And I'm sure we could add 2 or 3 others, and it would probably be a good thing, but at a certain point, the diagram gets too complicated. So I will say these 7, again, with my experience with Wilk, which is just one interaction, seem to work pretty well. He would actually agree that he attaches himself to all 7 of those too.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's really good. And it seems like that can be a good touchstone for public messaging on this, to be tapping into those. I talked a little bit yesterday about how just trusting the science wasn't going to resonate with a lot of people, but if you put it in terms of some of these 7, maybe,
Yeah, trusting the science is a little more in the web, and got to get it back to the pillar for people to go, oh, I see where you're going. Truth.
So, a big popular question from our crowd here. There's all these conspiracy theorists that are talking against scientific evidence and sometimes against specifically NIH or CDC, but what are the ways you respond to those conspiracy theories? Like, what have you found that's helpful?
Yeah, I can't tell you that I think I or the rest of the government has been all that successful. Certainly, most of the emails I get are sufficiently angry that it doesn't seem useful to respond. It just starts an initial trail of accusation. So if I'm doing anything about this, it's often in a written interview or a video interview. Again, I think what I have learned is to listen before you speak. And if somebody is caught up in one of those conspiracies, be sure you understand exactly what it is that is troubling them. I understand, for instance, there are people who are quite concerned about whether there is abortion tissue in the vaccines. And I can say, well, wait a minute, tell me what you mean by that. And many times they believe there's actually fresh abortuses that have been used to make these vaccines. Absolutely not true. There is a fetal cell line that was derived in 1970 from a Scandinavian elective termination that has been in culture for the last 50 years and that is used in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine as part of the preparation. And that troubles people, and I think they should know about that. The Catholic Church has decided they think it is still entirely appropriate for believers to use that vaccine. So if somebody's worried about that, I want to really have that conversation about, okay, what is your understanding and why is this a source of concern? Some of them, it's just hard to know what to say. People who said, well, you know, Bill Gates has his chip in that syringe. We have 10 doses in each syringe. So does that mean there's 10 chips? And does that mean somebody got 2 and somebody didn't get any? Because it's not going to be, well, never mind. But that has widespread. Something like 6 or 7% of people believe that.
Wow, it's that high. Oh, the flood of misinformation. It's very hard to counter. So here's a good question from somebody who says they're a university educator, and they often wonder, how can we aid our students in developing resilience during stressful times? You have been through an incredibly stressful 2 years, and yet you seem here to be sane, loving, resilient, hopeful. What has sustained you?
Well, I think that is a critical lesson we all have to reflect on after the incredibly difficult times that everybody has been through with this pandemic. And that applies to kids and teenagers and adults, people whose lives have been upended, who's had terrible economic distress, parents who are trying to run their jobs and their children at home for months on end. This has been just an incredibly difficult time. And it certainly challenges all of us to figure out what sources do we use for strength and resilience. I've certainly needed to lean on those a lot myself. For me, faith is such a critical part of that. Yeah. To start every day in the Word and before all the other things start to go wrong, and to try to get anchored. And I've been in the Psalms a lot for the last 2 years because that's where there's a lot of crying out for help from those who are having a tough time, like David. Psalm 46 is still my favorite, the one that's right next to my computer screen when I get up in the morning. God is our refuge and strength, and ever-present help in trouble. Hey, we've been in trouble, and we're still in trouble. But God is there. That's a promise. God is our refuge and strength. Music is also a source of resilience and comfort for me. Especially if it's music that's attached to faith. I've played my piano and my keyboard a lot for the last 2 years. I wish I had played it more with other people. I really missed that. I love this morning being able to sing and worship with all of you. Oh my gosh, it's been a long time before having this kind of experience with this kind of people. And yeah, I do have a few other probable hobbies, like my Harley Davidson, that also gives me a chance to unwind a little bit. And the cat, let's not forget the cat.
Oh, yes, who might love you.
Who might love me on certain days. And I'm also a bit of an exercise nut because I think we are called to keep our bodies healthy as well as our spirits, and it gives you that kind of resilience that you might otherwise not get.
Yeah. I think that's a great summary of like what it is to be human, all those different aspects. You can't just live in your head and live with the conflict. And, yeah. I'm curious, how do people respond to your faith these days? You know, like when your book first came out, you're being appointed to NIH, there are these people saying, oh, you can't have a Christian leading NIH, and there was that militant atheism going on. But now, is it a reception different in any way? Or?
I haven't encountered a whole lot of strong negative resistance. Occasional eye rolling if I bring this up in front of somebody who doesn't necessarily think it belongs in the conversation.
Yeah.
But compared to, 10 or 15 years ago, you know, the new atheists were on a real roll maybe back 15 years ago with Dawkins and Hitchens, Dennett, Sam Harris, the Four Horsemen, as they like to call themselves.
Yeah.
They, I think, got a lot of attention and a lot of people sort of seeing their angry approach to put-downs of faith as something that they kind of enjoyed. But I don't sense that that's as much catching the attention now. I think people are so beaten up. They don't want to be beaten up about this one, too.
Okay.
I did a podcast with Richard Dawkins, which I guess is going to air sometime in the next few weeks. So watch BioLogos. I assume you guys will point to it.
Yep.
And he was a lot mellower than he was when we had our last debate back in 2005 or 6.
Yeah. I would hope people would start to value your faith and see it as like, oh, here's a scientist who might be able to reach people of faith.
It is interesting during the time that I was NIH director, when there was an effort to reach out to faith communities, they would come to me and say, okay, Francis, this is yours. The other spokespeople are going to be great with the science, but maybe you have a little better chance to connect.
Yeah. There's also a popular question here about AI and some of the new technologies coming along, and how do we see God in these? How do we use our faith to navigate the challenges? Because I remember just before the pandemic, you were talking about gene editing of human embryos, and
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
And that's still out there as a big ethical quandary. Artificial intelligence applied to life science is both enormously exciting and also something we need to look at really carefully to be sure that it doesn't somehow incorporate within it prejudices, because the AI is only going to give you an outcome that the training data had in it. But for such things as figuring out, as my own lab does, how it is that genes turn on or off in particular situations, we're trying to understand diabetes. So we take stem cells derived from people who have diabetes or controls. We get a skin biopsy. We do this magical thing of converting them to pluripotent stem cells. And then we, in the laboratory, over the space of 32 days, convince that pluripotent cell to become a cell in the pancreas that would make insulin. Still growing there in a dish, but it's a beta cell. It makes insulin. It responds to glucose. It's a lot like what you have right now in your pancreas. But it came from somebody whose situation we know really well. We have their complete genome sequences. And we can watch each step along the way over those 32 days to see what's happening during this process. This is way too much data for me to be able to make sense of. But artificial intelligence and machine learning can take those patterns and can teach you things about how this network of controls of development are actually working, and how individual genetic differences that might make me at a higher risk for diabetes, which I am, compared to somebody else, how does that actually work in a part of the human development process that you can't otherwise observe, but you can in this wonderful laboratory process. So I would be in trouble without AI to help me there. So I'm a fan, but I'm also really carefully looking at ways, if you're using this, for instance, for trying to manage healthcare, does it just incorporate all the inequity that's already there as if that was truth? That would be a big mistake.
Yeah. Oh, those are some really good things to watch out for, yeah. Let's see. Checking all the questions people are interested in. There's so many here. I think there's some questions here about suffering and our belief in God, and how do we mend our hearts and relationships fractured by the conflicts of COVID? I think some people, they've seen such division in the church, their faith is at risk, or they have their family's fractured or their church is fractured. I was just hearing from people at this conference, physicians whose patients used to trust them and now suddenly are trusting social media more than what they have to say. It's a problem we're all dealing with, but I don't know if you have any other words to speak into it.
It is, and of course the suffering we're going through has various causes, and some of it is natural, although that doesn't make it any easier. This virus appearing in the first place, which almost certainly was a natural process coming from a bat, maybe through a raccoon dog to a human. The idea that this is a lab accident hasn't been entirely ruled out, but there's no evidence to support it, and most scientists would say that's less likely than this being what's happened in the past with these kinds of transmissions. But that does happen when you begin to crowd people together with other species in ways that we haven't traditionally done, and to have people that close to big colonies of bats, whether it's causing Ebola in Africa or causing a coronavirus in China, I don't know that we can blame God for that. At the same time, when you see this virus then cause such terrible suffering and death, approaching 1 million deaths now in the United States, that just breaks your heart, that grieves you. I don't have good answers for how best to get your mind around that part of it, but I do know that I serve a God who knows about suffering. And that somehow makes it really different than if I didn't know about Jesus and the cross.
Yeah.
That whatever I'm looking at and going, God, why would you let that happen? I don't have to explain to God what suffering's about. God knows that. God is grieved by that. God's heart is breaking all the time, just like ours are. And that somehow, maybe for a Christian, makes suffering a little more possible to get your head around, but it's still something you rebel against. I always go back to C.S. Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, because I find in my own thinking, I don't get very far without sort of a refreshing look at this from somebody who's thought a lot more deeply about it. Mm-hmm. And of course, many others you can point to, Bonhoeffer, for instance.
Yeah.
Viktor Frankl.
But knowing that our God came and suffered as well it becomes in that person of Christ that we find our comfort.
That is the comfort.
So let's see here. You mentioned, how many neurons did you say there are in the brain? 86
well,
billion?
I hope I have 86 billion. It might be a little less than it used to be, but that's the rough number. Yeah, and each one of those has 1,000 connections. So think about that as a complexity.
Oh, okay, because I was going to say, I've got more stars in the galaxy than there are neurons, but if you add in the number of connections, you might be winning.
Close.
Yeah. You say it's the most complicated thing in the universe. And as an astronomer, I might have to agree with you. If the universe, like a star, you can describe with 4 equations.
Yeah.
And we both love second-order differential equations. Well,
Yes,
there's about 4 equations, so you can describe most of what you want to know about a star. But a brain...
Oh, boy, yeah. Some people worry that our brains aren't complicated enough to understand our brains.
I love it.
That's why we need artificial intelligence.
There you go. There's more. Put those chips to work. Well, we're so thankful for the wisdom that you've brought us here today and your vision. We'll be picturing that web and those pillars all day today, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Francis.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you all.